And we're not going to be recording your faces because on the screen that we're recording is just going to be the speaker and the information that's being presented tonight. I'd like to ask you all to please mute your microphones. And then also, because of the number of people that we have signed up, we got more than 85 people who contacted us about this workshop. It's going to be very hard to monitor you. So if you want to ask a question, please type that question into chat. And by hard to monitor you, I mean, we're not going to have anybody watching all your faces. And so if you raised your hand, we may not notice that if you have a question. So you can type a question into the chat, and then we're going to have a time for questions and answers also at the end of the session. I'd like to introduce at this time Graham Hunter. Graham is a dear friend and also a fellow voter, and I've came into the education department with the Bellingham Salem Power Squadron as Graham as my mentor. Graham has been 30 years with the squadron. He's been boating for 60 years. He has a sailboat, which he will talk about. He's hands down a fabulous instructor. In 2020, he was nominated by our squadron and selected at the national level for the United States Power Squadron as for the Chaplain Award, which means that it's the highest award in education for the United States Power Squadron. Graham has innovated a lot of props. Tonight, you'll get to see his anchoring prop and tools that he uses for teaching. He also is very active with our on the water training, which is part of our ABC beginning introduction to boating course, and also a boat handling course that he often teaches. And he'll talk a little more about that. Graham also invented what we call our flare chute, which is part of Sea Skills. Sea Skills is an activity we host in Blaine every May, April or May, except for the last 2 years because of COVID. So with this, I will turn the program over to Graham and we'll get started.
Thank you very much, Mindy. Thank you.
So please give us any feedback in chat if we need to hear from you about not being able to hear or see or any other technical issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Mindy. So this is our second Zoom presentation as an educational event, and we're still experimenting. We're having fun with cameras, different types of props and so on, as Mimi said. And we're right now in the big room at the Blaine Senior Activity Center in Blaine, Washington. And thanks to the director and staff of the center, they've allowed us to come in after hours to do our Zoom session. And little do they know we're giving them great credit for this, but we really appreciate the excellent Ethernet connection and the facilities here. The program is basically be really aware of how to anchor and then be confident that your anchor is going to hold. So one of the things I wanted to point out before we begin is where we are in the world. This is a satellite view of the joining point of this Strait of Juan de Fuca and Georgia Strait. Our little playground is right down here in the center, the San Juan Islands. We've got Vancouver in the north, the Olympic Peninsula to the south, and Seattle and so on. So where we are, we're sort of centered between Blaine, Bellingham, and Anacortes. And that's our large view. Now I'm going to give you the smaller view. So this is chart 18-421. And this is the southern part of the chart, and it shows the mass of islands that consist of the San Juan Islands. There are some of the Canadian Gulf Islands and a few other islands south of the San Juans. But basically, this is our cruising area, our local cruising area. The term gunk holding comes to mind because of the holding power of the ground around the islands. we heard of the term gunk holing from a book called Gunk Holing in the San Juans, first published about 40 years ago by Joe Bailey and Al Cummings. And they that was the first cruising guide that Donna and I used when we went out venturing out into the San Juans. And the first time we raised the anchor, I found out what the term gunk holing meant. Gunk is, I think, particular to this area where you have the glacial runoff from centuries back, mixing with the mud and giving you a really excellent holding material for anchoring. And it occurs in most of the bays in the San Juans. San Juans also have a number of marine state parks. So these are islands up here and in various other places in the San Juans, limited to boaters and boating, kayakers, sailors. But there's plenty of other places to anchor as well. Lots of bays, backyards for people who have farms. You can just pull up to their, close to their shoreline and anchor, providing it's a safe anchorage. So I just wanted to introduce our playground. This session is going to last a little under an hour. And there's a certain variability because we're going to present some things and then open for discussion or answering of questions. And this is new to us, so we're going to experiment, and you're part of the experiment. Thank you very much for coming. This course tonight is adapted from the 2-hour anchoring course in the boat handling class. I've just abridged it by taking the major elements that gets you started anchoring and anchoring safely. We're going to be holding the class in January, starting about January the 11th for 6 weeks next winter. So just to put that little promo out for the class itself. This tonight's workshop is also kind of a refresher for those of you who have already been out anchoring and had the fun of discovering new things about anchoring and the islands and the peacefulness and the beauty out there. So the goal of this workshop then is to dispel any myths you might have gained about anchoring and to give you some techniques about the anchoring process. We want this to be an interactive workshop. So you have some work to do. Kind of stay close to your keyboard and get ready to use the chat function if you have any questions. And I know there's quite a few people signed in tonight, but we'll try to take any questions as they come up. Bill's going to read the questions. He's going to get my attention, read the question, and we'll answer them at that time. And if we can't, we'll just put them on the back burner and at some point address them during the evening. I hope that all works for you. And then towards the end of the slide presentation at the very end, I'll have some skill testing questions for you so you can be prepared for those. So we're using the PowerPoint slides from the boat handling course. I've come up with a teaching aid called, I call it the anchoring simulator, which we'll see in just a second. And of course we have the wonderful whiteboard with some models and stuff like that. So the question really is, what is anchoring? And I know you're just bubbling with enthusiasm. You want to jump in there and answer that question. I'll just give you my definition and see if it plays along with yours. To me, anchoring is putting an object down to the bottom of the ocean. It's called an anchor, and it's attached to the boat with a line of some sort. Use that to hook onto the bottom of the ocean to keep the boat in one place, and it's a temporary attachment, so at some point you can raise the anchor and carry on. That's my personal definition of anchoring. And this is what this workshop's all about. I know a number of people have never anchored. They've been boating for years, and their anchor's still up in the bow roller, never been wet. And there are reasons for this. People with dogs, for example, would prefer to go to a dock or maybe to a marina. You probably have a phobia about being overnight on an anchor and you don't want to let go of something. So there's mooring buoys. Unfortunately, on the weekends especially, you may go up to the islands expecting to pick up a mooring buoy and they're all occupied by the time you get there. That's just a hazard of the vacation time you have out here. And if there's not a dock available, a marina, mooring buoy, your next option is anchoring. Turns out it's a very pleasant exercise. So let's look with the simulator here. Let's look at what sort of a typical anchoring might involve. So you've been fishing out somewhere north of Orcas Island, and you've maybe put down a prawn trap or a crab trap, something of that nature. You decide you want to take a break from all this boating and go ashore. So you come into Echo Bay at Susha Island, and you see that there's an open spot near the shore, about 200 yards from the beach, and there's 15 feet of water there. So you decide that's where you want to anchor. So here's what you do. This is all shop-made props, so bear with me with the anchor I'm using. It's just a grappling hook, but basically it shows that you are now lowering the anchor to the bottom, and then keeping the anchor, just slowly let it drop so that it aligns with the position of the boat. And then slowly back the boat away from the anchor so you're at a comfortable distance. You feel the anchor tug the boat's line, so you throttle down to idle, and the boat stays in place. Then you decide to set the anchor, so you back up a little bit more, add a little bit of power, and the boat stays in one place. And you say, "This is it. We're here for the day until we decide to come back." You go back to neutral, shut off the engine, just prepare to go ashore. But being prudent boaters, you all should stop and turn around and look at the situation you just got yourself into and say, what can go wrong here? So this is a little exercise for you. We're looking for a few answers from people. If you can think of a 2 or 3 word, what can go wrong? For example, maybe the anchor doesn't dig in or something like that. And we're just going to wait and get some answers here. What I want you to do is look at the anchor, look at the anchor connections all the way to the boat. Think about what anchoring does.
Swing into a neighbor.
Very good. You might swing into a neighbor. That's something we're going to address during this program.
Are you too close to other boats?
Too close to other boats. We're going to talk about how to anchor and not get involved with other boats. Good.
Kelp bed?
Kelp bed. Yes, the anchor may not dig into the ground. There's a solution for that as well. We'll come to that.
Tide can shift?
Right, you're good. The tide can shift. Well, the tide's going up and down all the time. So if you anchor at low tide, you can expect at some point your boat's going to float a little higher. Is that going to affect your anchoring? Yes, it will. And it might actually cause you to come unglued from the bottom. Without
Currents and wind?
Currents and wind. There might be a strong current flowing. The wind's definitely going to be blowing. And if you haven't checked the forecast, well, we'll talk about that a little bit later. Yes, but the wind can be a factor.
Tide goes up and you don't have enough rode out?
Perfect. Tide goes up, the water comes up, and you don't have enough rode out. We'll deal with that.
Uninspected ground tackle fails.
Very good. It was an audio of someone asking about the uninspected ground tackle. So this is your ground tackle right here, from the anchor through the chain right up to the boat. Somewhere along there, that could fail. We have to have that inspected. Okay. Any others? Okay, good. So what we're going to do then, maybe look at a few other examples of what might go wrong. The anchor may foul as you put it down. Maybe you drop the anchor line around the anchor and it catches on that. The road, which is the connection to the boat, may actually untie from the boat. And I think we've covered pretty much all the ones that I came up with, 8 or 9 things that can happen to a boat when it's anchored. So we're going to switch to some slides now and a short video clip to give you a kind of a good introduction to anchoring. Thanks, Mimi. Okay. 2 definitions, road and scope. Road is the flexible connector between the boat and the anchor. And I don't know why they call it road. It's one of those terms that came down to us over the generations of boaters. scope is something I'm going to describe to you later with the simulator, and it's the ratio of the depth of water from the bow roller down to the bottom to the length of the road you have out. So it comes as a ratio of, or the other way around, the length of road to the depth. And they picked 7:1 as the natural, ideal, normal condition scope. We'll find a little later in this program that there's variations on that 7:1 ratio. Okay. Okay, we're going to look at anchorages. The first thing before you put the anchor down is, where are you going to anchor? First of all, is there enough shelter around the bay or area that you're going to be anchoring? You might be anchoring in the middle of or at the side of Bellingham Bay. You want to pick the side that's going to be in the lee of the wind, so you have maybe a mountain behind you. So look for shelter, basically areas of landmass around you. Okay. So weather is the next thing. Before you go boating, you check the weather. Before you've gone from one place in the islands to another, you're going to check the weather for that day. And then you're going to find out what the winds are going to be for the time you're going to be anchoring. This may affect how you anchor and where you're going to select your anchorage. The depth is a really important item because it's involved with that scope, the ratio of the depth to the length of road out. Then we have type of bottom. This is where someone mentioned the kelp. You want to have that anchor being able to penetrate through whatever's on the bottom into the gunk below the bottom, below that barrier. So type of bottom is important. Where do you find that information? Yeah, you find it on charts. You see symbols for mud being M, rocks or rocky, RKY, and so on. Sand bottom, they're all described in areas around the charts. And you want to look at the bay that you're going to see that it's got the kind of bottom that you're looking for. Unfortunately, I've never seen the word gunk. We'll talk a little about tide in other courses. Just I want you to be aware that every day in the San Juan Islands, your boat's going to rise and it's going to go to the bottom. If you're staying in one place, it's going to go down to low tide twice a day. There's usually a higher tide at one point during the day. You'll learn all about this in one of our piloting classes. Several of you mentioned swinging room, and that's quite critical. When you come into a crowded anchorage, there's a point of deciding where's the best spot. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but basically you want to be clear of other boats and where they're swinging. Unfortunately, there's also mooring balls in the bay. Those boats do not swing, and you want to make sure you don't swing into them. So there's a bunch of things to consider. You want to make sure you don't swing into shallow ground, for example, or up against some rocks. And the last item is anchoring etiquette. And it's a pity really that not everybody takes this class or anchoring classes before they go boating. Anchoring etiquette involves coming into an anchorage that might be full. And if you're the last boat or the second last boat to come in, and sometime during the night, the wind picks up or things get really foul and this anchorage all of a sudden gets too crowded, the last boat in is the first boat to weigh anchor and leave. And that's just the way it is, folks. It's an honor system, and it's good to discuss it with other boaters before, in the coffee shop and so on. What is this etiquette all about? Well, it's kind of important. Okay. Let's go to that YouTube. Oh, we have a question.
Just a comment. When considering swing room, first look to see which other boats are facing. Are they all facing the same way?
Good. When considering swing in the anchorage, check the positions of other boats. So I've set up a kind of an anchoring situation on a whiteboard. We'll look at that question. Yeah. Okay. Okay, now we'll look at that little short video clip. It's about 1 minute and 20 seconds, something of that nature. It's just a cute little video put on by some younger people who've got a nice, small, fast boat, but they really want us to know the best way to anchor and some of the things to be careful about. And while Mimi's setting that up, we'll think about what's involved in anchoring a small boat versus a larger boat. All boats really should have an anchor or some means of anchoring. You can get some small anchors and some quite large ones. So there are differences, but the principle is the same. You're putting something down to hook onto the bottom. How do we look at this? Okay. All right, well, we'll just carry on.
I'll have to come back to that.
Okay, we can do that video a little bit later if we find it. So I'm going to move around to the whiteboard and we'll discuss the anchoring procedure.
Natalie?
So the first part of anchoring procedure is if you're with a partner on your boat or several other people considered as crew, before you even think about anchoring, discuss with the people you're going out with what's involved in anchoring, what you're going to expect of them, and the communications between the helm and the person at the bow. One of the main things is to look at the charts, make sure you check the anchorage at where you want to go. A good source of information is local knowledge. You get that from guidebooks, from cruising guides, from other boaters in the yacht club or marina or the coffee shop somewhere. You find out people who've experienced other bays and so on. At one point, a friend of ours said, I've always wondered about Watmo Bay down the San Juan Islands. Would you mind going there and telling me what it's like? Well, my wife and I hadn't been there before, so we ended up down at the south end of the San Juan Islands. Watmo Bay is this tiny little bight tucked in the corner of Lopez Island. Turned out to be a delightful and small anchorage. So there's always, that was his way of finding out what's the story with Watmo Bay. Well, you're going to be checking the weather forecast, the wind forecast specifically, and also I made a note to myself to mention eelgrass beds. There are areas in the islands that have eelgrass, which is an area we do not want to anchor in. Eelgrass supports fish, eggs, fish breeding, and our anchors do a wonderful job of chewing them up and destroying them. So the state has delineated certain areas in the San Juans and elsewhere that are eelgrass beds. So you avoid those if you see those marked. So now you enter the anchorage, you come into the bay, and the first thing you do is look around, get the binoculars out. Who's there? What's going on? The wind is blowing from somewhere off to the right, blowing all these boats in one direction. In this situation, there's a pretty good wind because all the boats are streaming in the same direction. We have a question. Yeah.
Where do you see the eelgrass marked?
I wish I could tell you that right now. I've seen it in some publications. My best suggestion is to go online and check out where you're going to find eelgrass in the area that you're going to be cruising.
Possibly Wagner's. My
Good,
discussion.
good point. Some of the cruising guides like Wagner's might have the answer to that question. Where do you
Coast
find
Pilot.
the Coast Pilot, the official publication? Sure. Good. Before you get into the bay, however, you've discussed with your helmsperson and or the communication between the helmsperson and the person who's going to be doing the lowering of the anchor. And that's very important because once you get into the anchorage, talking back and forth is really not an option. The wind is great at taking the sound away, or there may be a windshield between the person at the helm and the person at the bow. So work out a system of hand signals. There are some you could read about, but really it's whatever you come up with that works. And for my wife and I, if I'm on the bow facing forward, I don't want to be looking at her all the time. So what I'll do is put my finger forward to motor forward, neutral, and then reverse, or however you want to signal. And if I want to go left or right, I use my whole arm, left and right. And while we're cruising the anchorage to check the depths, to find the depth that we want, occasionally we'll ask, what's the depth back there? So very little communication. You don't want to be known as the people who came into the anchorage shouting at each other. So it's just, you're yelling at me. No, I'm not. I'm just talking loudly. And it usually gets worse from there. So try not to be part of the entertainment in the bay, and you'll be fine. So you've gone through the anchorage area. You've found one guy here who's on a mooring boat. Okay, you want to kind of stay clear of him or them. You've got the boats that are anchored, all that's what's happening. The wind is blowing from there to there. So you decide to come and anchor in this spot here. So you're going to put the anchor down and then set the anchor from there. So you motor up to that position, and at this point, the person handling the anchor is on the bow. That's the person who is controlling what's going on. Is actually making sure that the anchor is down, is set, and the boat needs to move in a certain direction. That's the person who says that. The helmsperson is very important to keep a good lookout, see if there's anything that shouldn't be happening around. So keep the big picture in focus. So once the boat stops moving through the water, and this is critical, you don't want to be moving forward, release the anchor and start paying it out. So in our sailboat, we don't have a windlass. So I actually take the anchor, take it off the bow roller and start feeding it forward. And that's where these come in handy. Pair of gardening gloves, something to keep your hand off the chain. And if you're working with a windlass, it's even more important to keep your hand and fingers away from the working of the chain and windlass itself. So the anchor goes down. One of the nice things about paying it out by hand is you can feel when it touches the bottom, because it's usually heavy. As soon as it touches the bottom, you can feel the weight coming off. Then you have the signal go back the boat up. Now the boat's going to start backing away from the anchor. At that point, you just very slowly pay out until the anchor line is just laying on the bottom, nice and straight. So here we are backing down away from the anchor point. We'll give it a green dot here. So there you are. When you paid out the amount of road that you want to pay out to make it the right scope. So let's just talk about scope for a second. You're now in 15 feet of water, and you decide you're going to use the formula of 7-to-1 for scope. So doing quick math, you need to set out at least 105 feet of anchor road. How do you know? Well, you can see some of these anchors are, if they're a line, twisted nylon line, 3-strand line, they'll have some of these markers in the chain or in the line itself, or the chain may have some painted band or a plastic wrap strap, that kind of thing. So you know when you're out to 105 feet, that mark should be on the water surface, or you can add more if you're going to be measuring from the bow roller. So now when you're at the extent of the boat's road, everything's calm, all good, then arrange to select reverse. So if you want reverse, and then you want to speed up the engine a little bit. Now this is so dependent on the type of boat. We have a sailboat, little, 18-horse motor. We can run that thing to full power. If you've got a large cruising powerboat, maybe not so much. This is up to you. What you want to do is back away from the anchor and get the anchor digging into the bottom. So we have a question.
Just a comment, when you're using the markers, the comment is use darker colors.
Ah, okay. A comment that darker colors work for this person. Yeah, I bought these yellow marks some time ago, and I found they work for me. It just works better at night and so on like that. But if dark works for you, that's all the better. Okay. The point of what will happen when you first go in reverse and start to set the anchor will start to drag across the bottom for just a moment. And if it's the right kind of bottom, the anchor tip will start to dig in. At that point, the boat will slow down, and then you'll feel the boat come to a stop. What you should do is also look sideways to see if the boat has actually stopped moving. So maybe you have, oh, I don't know, a shoreline out here with a tree and a rock and line, or other objects on the shore. When your boat is moving, all these things are moving in relation to each other. Once the boat stops, the picture freezes. So you want to know that you're happy that the picture for you has frozen and you're stopped. You check with the person at the helm, you check with the other passengers on the boat. Do your transits, we call them transits because they're a line, a visual line through here. Are your transits lining up? And when that everybody agrees that the transits have stopped moving, then you can then idle down and stop. Yeah.
Okay,
Question.
2 questions. One is on a 7-to-1 ratio, if it's 100 feet deep, does that mean you put out 700 feet of scope?
Absolutely right. Yeah. So it's the depth times the scope that you want.
And then the other one is, with backing down on anchor to set with a heavy boat, say 15 tons, should you back down on the windlass or use a snubber?
Oh,
Good question.
I
I
was wondering what I owed the pleasure, but
No, and I apologize. I was just.
That was the wrong question.
No, somebody's talking over.
Okay. Are we okay now? All right. The windlass is kind of the weak spot in the whole equation. When you finish backing down and you're ready to do the setting of the anchor, you secure the anchor rod to something like a cleat or however you're going to secure it for the duration, something really solid. With that point, with the backing down done, then you can, if you have an all anchor, or all chain rod, you can take some slack on the chain and put a snubber, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And that'll take up some of the motion of the rod. I think that was the question. Okay, all right,
It does say, could you start over with your explanation?
okay. So we'll start again. This is good. Good questions. So you put the anchor down. You start the boat. The wind might take it for you, might start you backing up. The wind or the engine. Person at the bow is paying out the road. He's looking for that magic number that's been prepared. Boat comes to that spot. Cleat off the line. Cleat off the line or the anchor or the chain, I mean, and prepare to do the setting. Make sure everybody knows that you're going to be setting the anchor. Give the signal to the helmsperson. You want to go reverse. You want to speed it up. That's your signal for we're going to be doing the setting the anchor. The boat will start to move. And at that point, you can put your hand somewhere away from the windlass, put your hand on the anchor rod, and you'll feel a bit of a vibration. At some point, it will stop. And that means the anchor is now digging in. And then at that point, you can look sideways to the transits, pick a water tower lining up with a tree, something. When the engine is not able to move the boat backward any farther, the anchor is set. Then you idle down, shut off the engine, and you're all set for lunch or dinner or whatever it is that you came for. That's the anchoring process. I'll just pause for a second to see if there are any more questions.
Do you want me to try to pull up the video?
I've got a few more points to make and then we'll see if we can find that. Yeah. So, okay, good. One of the things you can do at this point is to tell everyone on board, look at your transits, find the things that you like to see on the shore that are lined up. And then have supper, come back, look again, are they still there? Now, if you're anchoring overnight, maybe it's some lights that you want to see. But quite often there's, it's dark, but it's not that dark. Maybe there's a headland or something on shore that you can pick out in the dark. So that's the whole business of transits. And that's important. Why? It's important that you be able to get out of bed at night, look out the window and say, oh, transits are still good. Go back to bed. Or, uh-oh, we have a problem. We got to do something about it. Pull on the shorts and put on a shirt and go out and deal with it. Okay, we'll talk about that as well. Let's see if we can find that video in here. I don't know if that's,
2 questions, Graham.
okay.
One is, if the anchor does not set, do you just start over?
If the anchor doesn't set right away, yes, it means that there's something about the bottom. That's a good question, by the way, and it happens a lot. It means that the anchor fluke has not been able to penetrate whatever it is in the bottom, or maybe it's you found a sandy patch that's the anchor just sifting through. Yeah, weigh anchor, find another sweet spot, go to that spot, try again. Try anywhere that you're comfortable in this bay. And if there isn't a spot, go to plan B, find another bay or find a marina, whatever's their comfort zone.
There's 3 more questions. You want them now, or?
Let's try them now. Yeah, it's a good time.
Okay. How do you sight enough road for tides?
How do we,
Enough road for the tides?
oh, good question. How do you account for the tides, the amount of road you're going to need? So does anybody know what the maximum tide is? So sometimes you get a 4-foot high to low tide. Sometimes you get a larger one. In the San Juans here, we're looking at maximum maybe 12 to 14 feet, something like that. So we're not talking about 7 times 12 to 14. So you should be prepared to have that extra road in your boat. What I'd like to do is just, I don't like to anchor at anything less than 20 or more than 20 feet, 25 foot maximum, because I don't have more than about 250 feet of road. If you have a larger boat with more holding capacity for your road, fine. You're much more freedom to move into deeper water. I much would prefer the 15 foot, 20 foot, that sort of thing. I don't want to go too shallow. And why is that? Because we may end up snugging the bottom with our keel. So, and that's not fun either. So be aware of the tide level, where in the range of tide that you're in when the boat stops in the bay. That'll give you an idea how much you're going to lose or how much you're going to gain.
So Graham, if you're anchoring in 20 feet
Mhm.
and the tide changes 12 feet, so it's 7 times 32,
Okay, yeah.
is that correct?
Well, I take the worst case scenario, the what can go wrong scenario, and I say, okay, let's here we are at 20 feet, and it's going to go up to 32 feet. Okay, I'm going to need 7 times 32. That's the figure I use. Or I move somewhere else. Let's say this isn't going to work for me. Yeah. Another question?
Will you be covering anchor alarms?
No.
Okay.
Okay, and I'll tell you why. Anchor alarms are a great thing if you've got a boat with lots of battery power and all the gee whiz stuff on board. We're a 30-foot sailboat with a house battery and a starting battery, and we don't like to allocate or have a radar going or a GPS going all night long. It's just something I don't prefer to do. I like to shut everything off. That's my answer. You'll find other people quite good at setting anchor alarms, and they come with great instructions. Good question, by the way.
Can you explain the use of the windlass to let the road out and haul back? Do you free spool it out?
I'm going to have to refer that question. Bill, can you answer that? You've had a windlass.
I believe it's considered poor technique to use your windlass to haul in or let out your boat.
Okay.
That the windlass manuals typically say to even when you're pulling in the anchor, that you drive up over the anchor and you just use the windlass to recover the chain.
Right. Okay. And then, but when you're backing away from the anchor, you just free falling the chain.
If you have that ability.
Okay. Yeah.
Some windlasses will back up.
Yep.
If it's a chain, it's gonna be a little different maybe than a rope that you
Right.
can just use as spool it on one side and
Right,
play it out. But I would keep the load off the windlass as much as possible.
and that's, I think the guide right there is to keep the load off the windlass. When you're securing, there should be no load at all on the windlass. And as Bill mentioned, when you're coming up to the anchor to weigh, we'll talk about that in just a second. These are great questions, and we were concerned about how the questions are going to play out with this workshop, but it's working out really well. Any more on the,
Does it matter what others have out for road when determining swing? If so, how do you find out that information about other people's road?
I love that question. I love it when it comes up in class, and I'd forgotten about it tonight. So you've anchored, everything looks nice. Forecast is a little bit of wind overnight, but maybe a rain squall, you're not quite sure. What I love to do is get in the dinghy, just row over to the next boat and say, how are you doing? What's your scope for tonight? And that answers, comes up with two answers. One person will tell you what their scope is, and you can say, okay, good, I'm happy with what I've got. And you can have a conversation about what your swing possibilities are, even if the wind goes 180 degrees. However, if they don't know what scope is, be aware that they're over there and you may want to move if they have some problems. Does that answer?
That's good. So shouldn't you always figure your scope for the highest tide while you're there?
Yes and no. So there's the thing about the gunk in these is really good holding ground. If you're familiar with an anchorage and you've always come up with an anchor that's really set when you go to weigh anchor and you have trouble getting it out, you might know that, gee, maybe 7 to 1's a bit too much. And I know a lot of people in my boating experience have set the anchor at 7 to 1. And if it's going to be a gale that night, they'll pay out to 10 to 1 or something more. But if it's going to be a nice, calm, flat, glassy evening, they'll shorten up to 3 or 4 to 1. I would think 4 to 1 would be your sort of minimum. And that's what your question's about here. Are you going to shorten your road to 4 to 1? So you don't have to go to full storm road.
Last question. If you are all chained, do you need a 7 to 1 road?
Another good question. And we're going to talk, actually, we'll leave that question till towards the end because we're going to talk about chain road versus a mixture of chain and nylon, 3-strand nylon. But man, great questions. Thank you.
There was a comment about an app for anchoring. Bill, did you see that?
There's an Android app called Anchor Pro.
I've not heard of any apps about anchoring, but welcome news. If you have any information about anchoring, I want to learn. We all do, actually. So any luck with that little video, or we should
Okay,
carry?
I'll give it a try here.
Okay.
Now, did you know that if you have an anchor on your boat, that there's, best practices on how to make sure you're anchoring it properly. You can't just throw it overboard and expect that that's exactly where you're gonna end up. And that is why we made this little clip I want to share with you. Check it out.
Setting the anchor. That chain may look like overkill, but it actually helps set the anchor. Plus, it saves the end of the rope from getting torn up on the bottom. It might also look like there's too much line, but we need to let out about 7 to 10 times as much anchor line as the depth of the water, depending on the wind strength and wave size. And we never anchor off the back of the boat. Instead, we anchor off the front. We slowly motor into the wind or current past where we want to end up. If we want to end up there, here's a good spot. And allow some room for changing currents and wind.
Now, if you like that little clip, then you're probably going to want to see the whole video, which you can see at boated.com. It's a site where you can get certified in boat safety. Also, make sure you leave comments and...
Okay, we'll move next to the slides. Go back to the slideshow. Actually, go back one to weighing the anchor. Down a little bit. That's it, right there. Good. So we'll talk about weighing anchor. We've covered a number of items so far. It doesn't hurt to cover things twice or three times. When you weigh anchor, you're now letting go of the thing that you has been securing your boat overnight, say, or for your lunchtime. And you want to be sure that you're ready to move and carry on with your boating once your anchor comes off the bottom. So once you start your discuss with the crew what your plan is, how you're going to weigh anchor, what you expect of them. Next step is to get the engine warmed up, running smoothly, and you're confident that's going to take you out of the anchorage. So the procedure then is to motor forward while the person at the helm, at the anchor point, is reeling in with the windlass. You can use the anchor windlass to bring the anchor line up into the boat. I guess this is the time to mention that at no time should your fingers be anywhere near that chain coming over the bow. It's going to come over, I'll see the picture of the windlass a little bit later, but it's going to go over a gearing section, then the anchor is going to drop into the bottom of the boat. If something causes a problem there, stop. If you're using a foot switch, for example, to raise and lower the anchor or move the windlass to move the chain, stop the action, cover up the switch. Most boats have a foot switch that you flip a cover over to prevent you from moving it accidentally. Cover up the switch and deal with the problem. Do not get distracted. Pay close attention to what's happening when the anchor chain is coming over the bow. If you sense that the boat is being pulled forward by the windlass, stop, let the windlass relax, and make sure the helmsperson knows you need to go forward. And just carry on until the boat's right over top of the anchor. At that point, the boat should stop, and the person on the bow continues bringing the anchor up. And that's where a pair of gloves comes in handy, because guess what happens while the anchor's been down? Especially overnight, you'll find lots of green scows attached to your rode and hooked up with the anchor, and sometimes even masses of kelp will come up with the anchor. So you may be involved with cleaning off the anchor and getting it all clear before you bring the anchor right over the roller. That person at the bow is occupied fully with that point. So make sure the helmsperson knows that maybe the boat should be moved away from other boats while this is happening. So complete awareness is everything is the main story here. So once the anchor is up, cleaned off, brought up and secured on board, then you're free to go to your next anchorage. So most anchoring lectures start with parts of the anchor. I thought it'd be more interesting to show what anchoring is all about. But now we're getting into the parts of the anchor because now we know why they are important. So this is a picture of a Danforth anchor. Two parts that are important are the fluke, the part that penetrates the bottom, and the shank. Just notice that the shank is 2 to 3 times longer than the flukes. That enables the anchor to be pulled into line with the boat. So the boat will pull on the end of the shank, and as it backs away, it lines up the flukes with the boat. In this particular anchor, the stock off to the side are critical points to keep the anchor flat with the bottom so the flukes dig in equally. So that's the Danforth anchor. So an anchor should have the weight, part of the weight for your boat. So the boat designer will have said you want an anchor of this particular size. So the person you bought the boat from may have equipped your boat with an anchor that he's very happy with, or she really wants to have you on that boat. But you know, skepticism doesn't hurt. You can check out the anchor, read about anchoring. Maybe this isn't the anchor for where you want to go. If you're going to take a cruise up the Inside Passage to Alaska, more than likely you're going to want 2, maybe 3 anchors. A regular anchor for your normal anchoring, maybe a smaller lunch hook for a quick in and out anchoring, or a storm anchor as well. Heavier anchor that you're going to need in the event of a bad blow. They have to have the right self-alignment and resettling. Someone, I'm sure, is thinking right now, what if the wind changes in the anchorage and the boat moves around in a circle? Anchors are designed to line up with wherever the boat's pulling it. I have yet to see a situation where the anchor gets pulled out of the bottom and has to be reset completely. Usually it gets turned slightly and around to your angle. I'm going to ask Bill and Mimi if you've had any problems with anchors coming out at night. No, we're getting a negative. Ralph, no, okay. Cameraman Ralph doing a great job. And obviously with boats is happy with his anchoring. Bottom penetration, that's the sharp point of the anchors. We'll look at some pictures in a minute. Holding power has to do with the flat part of the anchor flukes. Ease of retrieval, boy, that's important, especially in gunk holing. You'd think you'd have someone pouring a lead weight on top of your anchor if you're deep into gunk. It just takes a lot of patience for the anchor to ease itself out of the goo. And of course, ease of stowing. Larger boats tend to stow their anchors on the bow roller, and smaller boats have spots inside. So we're looking at a typical flat fluke anchor. It's good for most anchoring situations, mud, sand, not on rocks, and it's very hard going through weeds or grass of any sort. The plow anchors are designed to go through the bottom layer, through the weeds or whatever's stopping the anchor from penetrating. And they're generally heavier, generally for larger boats, and they're great for long-term mooring. They will work on rock, but they're particularly good with the mud. They are a plow. The claw anchor, and one type locally is known as the Bruce or the Lumar. They were designed for anchoring North Sea oil rigs. They would set out a number of these anchors, considerably bigger than the ones you'd use on a boat, but they've proven themselves in the North Sea. Then you have the scoop or fixed shank scoop anchors. I've just purchased one for our boat called a Rockna. Very happy with it. The roll bar gets the anchor oriented so that it starts to dig in very quickly. It's very strong for its weight. So it's a smallish anchor, very strong for its weight. And some pictures on stowing.
We have a buffa.
So you have
Are
a,
you familiar with the buffa?
um,
Somebody said they have a buffa.
I'm not sure, I'm not familiar with the term.
Good brand.
Is there a question, Bill?
No.
No, okay.
Oh, what do you do if your anchor gets stuck in the rocks?
Gosh, another good question. Let's go back a little bit here. Hard to see on that one. These pictures aren't not showing that they're at the junction of the shank and the flukes. There's a small hole attached in the metal. At that point, you can, if you're concerned about where you're anchoring, you can attach a line attached to a buoy, so you know where the anchor is when the anchor's down. And if the anchor refuses to come out, lifting it straight up, it might come out if you pull backwards on that buoyed line. So I hope that answers your question. We had a situation with a friend's boat, and we're in the squadron, we're monitoring the kayak portion of the ski to sea race. And our job was to anchor near Boulevard Park in Bellingham Bay, which we did. Anchored, enjoyed 5 or 6 hours of watching kayaks go by and having fun, so on. Then it became time to go, and Gary's anchor would not come up. He could come up over top of it, but it would not come up. And this is quite a large bayliner with a real beefy windlass, so we didn't want to stress that out. So what he had to do at that point was get a buoy and untie the anchor rod from the boat let the anchor rode free and identified by this buoy, and have a diver come back. Turns out it was caught on some old logging cables and equipment. So it really pays to know where you're anchoring, if it's been a scene of earlier industrial action, that sort of thing. In this case, he did not have a retrieval line on his anchor. That might have worked. Any other questions? Okay. Question now is, what size anchor for the boat? Now, I'm just going to show this as a table. These slides will all come to you as part of your handouts for this course tonight. The table will show you some generic numbers for boats and anchors, boat lengths and anchors. You can generally see the minimum size that you want, maybe go one size larger. That's the general sort of rule of thumb. But also talk to people who own similar size boats. People who own similar anchors, see how they perform. Okay.
Walking the docks and looking at it.
Oh my gosh, yes. Mimi just mentioned my favorite walking to the boat activity. I walk along the dock, and of course, when you're going between the fingers, you've got these bow rollers leaning over the dock that you're walking on, and I just look at their anchors. What have they got? Is the anchor shackled properly to the chain? There's lots of entertainment in that. But you also get to see what's the popular anchor for the day. So the question now is line or chain? Well, what keeps the anchor anchored is the fact that the shank stays flat to the bottom of the ocean. And anything that's going to raise that up is a problem. The boat pulling back on the anchor line, if it raises that shank enough, it's going to start to weigh the anchor. All nylon line is not going to help. Chain does help. It keeps the weight on the shank, keeps it down. For smaller boats, and we're in that category, we have about 35 feet of chain. It's a high test chain that is lightweight but strong, stronger than the average chain. And to that, I have about 250 feet of 3-strand nylon. The nylon works well because it stretches just a little bit, up to 20% of its length. When the boat is at anchor and the winds are blowing and you're experiencing large wave activity, the boat will tend to surge back against pulling on the anchor, and then the anchor will line will pull it forward. So the anchor nylon line works as a to absorb that shock. All chain is just, if you had just chain, it would be a shock to the boat when it came up hard. So someone mentioned earlier putting a snubber. We'll see a picture of that in just a few seconds. What you're seeing in the picture here is 2 types of line. The one on the left is the 3-strand nylon. It's good for anchoring. You see that metal loopy thing that's called a thimble. That's what you use to connect with the anchor chain if you haven't spliced it to the chain. That line stretches, it relaxes, and it will last a long time. It resists UV rays. It's not affected by salt water, but it doesn't hurt to wash it off periodically to get the salt crystals out of the core. The one on the right, I would recommend against it. Double braided line, its main feature is that it's very strong and it does not stretch. So it makes a poor anchor line. Okay. Chain comes in a variety of types. There's the BB, something called proof coil, and high test. So there are other types of chain as well, but this is something you need to discuss with your chandler. Chain comes in different sizes. If you're using a windlass, the geared part on the side of the windlass is called a gypsy, and it accepts only certain kinds or sizes of chain. So you have to make sure if you're going to change the chain, be aware of what your windlass can do with it. for smaller boats, getting a high test chain, which is usually smaller and lighter for the same strength, might be a good idea. It's less weight and it won't upset the balance of your boat. Okay, we have, I think we've run out of. I have one more picture to show. That's the windlass, and I think we are. There we go. So there's the baby. The windlass, a real back saver. But be prepared not to fully count on it. If the windlass can fail, it's an electric motor that can fail. Hydraulic motor, there could be problems with that. So be prepared for the eventuality. You may have to pull that chain in by yourself. Real caveat, keep the fingers away from that when it's in use, or even when it's not in use and you might be thinking of using it. When you're weighing anchor, again, the point is that you move the boat forward and use the windlass to take up the slack. When you get over top of the anchor, the boat stopped. And that's the time where the windlass should be working at its hardest, to just raising the anchor slowly. And I mean really slowly out of the mud at the bottom. Don't expect it to work immediately, because it may have to dig those flukes out of many inches of hard holding mud. Okay, I think that ends that particular portion. Right, okay, so we're going to look at the scope calculation. We've actually talked about that quite a bit so far, so we'll just switch over to the simulator here, and we'll have a look at what's happening with the road. Okay, we have two options. One is to knock over the simulator. There we go. Thank you. I haven't worked out a combination of nylon and chain with this simulator. It just wasn't part of my game plan. But I want to show the difference between working with just a rope rode and chain. So if you're anchoring with just a rope, you can see that if the wind blows and you're picking up some waves action, the boat will be pulling back right away. The pole is becoming vertical on the anchor shank. What keeps the anchor hooked is the shank flat to the bottom. So you need to keep that in mind when you're using the type of rode you're using. So to illustrate the difference, this is type of chain. We're going to set it at 4:1 scope. So the way wind picks up, the current picks up, and the anchor chain has to come up first before it starts to pick up the shank of the anchor. And then it takes quite a pull. If you find that's not enough, or the anchor starts to drag, you can now pay out more. Look at the difference in the angle of the chain to the bottom and the shank of the anchor. So this is me pulling as pretty much as hard as I can, and the anchor shank is still flat to the bottom. There's one other thing to do, is to add a thing called a sentinel. We'll look at that in just a few seconds. A sentinel is a weight. Another term for it is a kellet. You add a weight to the chain. Usually the weight is on a line that you slide down the chain 20, 30, 40 feet. Let it stop there. And then it starts to be the point that's holding the chain down. So then when the boat starts to move, it has to pick up the chain holding that kellet or the sentinel, and up it comes first. But it's the one thing that's keeping the chain from moving the shank of the anchor up, way back there. The book for boat handling actually suggests using another anchor if it's really serious. If you're in a gale, you can just hook another anchor on somewhere along here, gives you double protection. The anchor pulls the chain down and is more dig-in power as well. So there's a number of options here for you. So we'll go back to the slides if we could, and we'll look at a few more pictures of the connections.
There was a question, Bill.
Did you, oh,
If you're waiting to get a question answered, just write it down or type it in, of course.
just a note, a thimble will not go through a low profile windlass. And then a question, can you use a Sentinel on rope?
The first question about thimbles, that's that kind of a pear-shaped metal thing at the end of the rope road. It will not go through some windlass gypsies. So make sure you've got all that organized before you go cruising. You want it, if you're going to use your windlass, make sure it's sized for what you've got in your way of connections. The other question had to do with, can you put a Sentinel on a rope road? And the answer is absolutely. In fact, you might need to. If you have a rope road, you could slide down a fishing lead weight ball or anything that's heavy. Let that pull the road down to the bottom, and that is the first defense against the anchor coming up. Good questions. All right. I'm going to move on through some of the slides. All set. Good. So it's a typical snubber picture right here. The boat owner has clipped on something to the chain and brought it back to a firm point to secure in the boat, leaving some slack on the chain. There's different designs. There's some that have two lines attached to a metal plate that hooks onto the chain. But whatever happens is you've got to have some slack on the chain so you don't get that, dramatic punch when the chain comes tight. This is what I use for enjoyment going down the marina. I'm looking at this picture here. The anchor has chain attached to it. The chain is shackled to the hole at the end of the shank. And you're looking at a shackle here, and you see some sort of a yellowy, coppery colored stuff on the left-hand side, and that's called seizing. And it's the seizing that prevents that shackle pin from turning, backing out, and coming loose. And once it comes adrift, you've got the anchor attached to nothing and the chain attached to the boat. So all those connections are important, starting with the anchor, through the chain, to the nylon connection, or all the way back to the boat connection. Everything's important and should be inspected on a regular basis. Before you go cruising in the summertime, make sure you have a really good look. Lay the anchor road completely out on the dock and inspect everything. We have a couple of questions. Yeah.
In a strong blowing current in the same direction of the wind, will chain come off the bottom in line with the rope? Example of, in this situation, does chain reduce the amount of road or scope required?
Boy, I don't allow that to factor in. Chain helps, there's no question about it. But I just include chain and rope in my scope calculations. That's a simple. If it's going to be a heavy blow, let out more, and more is better. I hope that answers the question.
If there's a rule of thumb, is there a rule of thumb for the length of snubbers?
No. Or just put it this way, I'm not aware of it at this point. What you can use, snubbers flex, so they stretch and they retract. And they have to be able to do it consistently and not break. And they have to be able to do it. I mean, if they don't stretch at all, then there's no point in having one. So it's a matter of shopping around and finding out what the people in chandlery say about the snubber you're about to purchase. Remember that you can use a nylon line as a snubber if it's connected to the chain, maybe two lines attached to the chain back to the boat on either side. So good questions.
Graham, this is Larry, if I could talk. And that's on the snubber. It also lowers the attachment point. So if you have, say, 10 feet of snubber out there, not only does it take the weight off the winch, but it also means that you've lowered your depth by 10 feet.
Is that Larry? Yeah, thank you very much, Larry. And Larry's comment was if you have a snubber with enough length to it, it lowers the attachment point of the boat to lower to the water. So that increases the effectiveness of the scope. So more snubber, better scope. I think that's the simplest way of putting it. And certainly makes for a much more comfortable night if the wind's blowing. Good. This is great. The system's working well with the questions coming in.
Is there a common ratio of chain to rope?
The reading I've done should have minimum of 30 foot of chain, 40, 50 feet, whatever your boat can accomplish and store. But there's no particular rule of thumb that I'm aware of.
I've heard the chain, the length of your boat.
1 foot of chain for length of boat. Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and sometimes experience will tell you. Yeah, good. I think I've got a couple more slides. Yeah, there's a picture of the Sentinel on its own line, sliding down the road. So it's attached to the boat at a separate spot, and it slides down. In this case, it's a red ball. Okay.
There's a question here. Does a bridle and a snubber achieve the same purpose, taking the load off the windlass?
Absolutely, yeah. We've been talking about keeping the load off the windlass. The bridle is the 2 lines coming from the boat to the chain in a V sort of formation. A snubber could be a single thing. Either way, you're taking the load off the windlass completely. So it's a separate way for the anchor to pull on the boat. Okay, we got a thumbs up. All right. The last slide is just a way of marking. You can see the darker and lighter markings. It only works in this case with a 3-strand nylon. You don't need to do anything else except slide the strip of plastic through the road, and then when the road tightens, it captures that little strip very nicely. If you have anchor, come up with your own magical way of marking the anchor road. I always think of, what's that fellow who wrote about paddle boats in the Mississippi?
Mark Twain.
Mark Twain, yeah. So I always think of Mark Twain when I see people putting 3 bands of paint around the anchor and then 4 bands and a wide and all different markings. So Mark Twain, however it works for you. Okay. The last thing really is chafe protection. If you're working with rope road, you need to keep it protected. If it starts to rub against metal, the rope itself will start to heat up and melt. And over time, you'll lose the strength in the rope. So here they're using some sort of fabric. I've always gone to our local hardware in Bellingham, it's Hardware Sales, and they sell like 1.5-inch fire hose. Well, who'd have thought? Fire hose is perfect. I just slipped that over the road, and it's worked really well for me for a long time. But you may have some other good ideas. 30 years ago, leather was the big deal, but a strip of leather was 40 or 50 bucks, I think, and kind of out of our price range. So fire hose works for me. So have you been paying attention? Oh, I'm sure you have. Well, here we go. The selection of the anchor type for the best holding power performance is defined by, you got 4 choices here. The depth of the water, the length and the weight of the chain in your anchor rod. We've been talking about that a bit. The sea bottom conditions, or perhaps the length and beam of your boat. So what's the best selection of the anchor type? And I'm going to give you the answer here. If you selected C, you were correct. If you selected A, B, or D, and you want to know more about it, send us a question. Okay, we're going to move on to the next one. This is quite easy. We're talking about it here. Anchor rod is the ability of an anchor to hold on a sea bottom. The length of the line or chain. The length determined by the amount of available storage on your boat. Or the length of the line and or chain between the boat and the anchor. And if you answered D, you're correct. Road is a thing, and it's the chain or line or chain line combination. Okay, this is very appropriate. Adding additional length of chain between the anchor and the line only adds handling problems, enhances the holding power of the anchor, increases the potential for road abrasion. And that's a concern because you have nylon on the bottom, and if you have a rocky bottom, there's wear going on. Adds unnecessary cost and weight to the anchor system. So adding additional length of chain. Oh, that's a puzzler. And again, if you answered B, you're correct. But why? Why are you correct? Does anybody want to answer why? Okay, Ralph, the cameraman, gave me the answer. He moved his hand in a horizontal motion, meaning the shank of the anchor is held to the bottom. Is that right, Ralph?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Okay. And here's the gimme. The normal average scope for anchoring is
C.
Thank you. Judy got it 7-1 with the caveat, caveat that you set the anchor at 7-1 and then bring, if you feel it's appropriate, and it's going to be a calm night, maybe come into 4-1 or 3-1, something like that. I'll tell you a little story. I have a diesel engine on my sailboat. It's a small engine, and you have to reach in and turn on the fuel to the engine before you start the engine. That makes sense. So I started the engine up, forgetting to turn on the fuel, which gave us enough time to undo the lines, back out of the slip, and get going into the marina. At about that point, the engine stuttered a little bit and then quit. So now we're in the marina floating, and we've got boats to the right and boats to the left, people moving around. The only thing I could think of, other than screaming for help, was to go up and put the anchor down. And the anchor went down, touched the bottom, I paid out a few more feet, boat stopped. There was no wind. It worked quite well. So the road was maybe, I mean, the scope was maybe a half, but it worked. Okay. So as we mentioned earlier, we have a question. Okay,
Just one question.
thank you.
I painted my chain instead of using flags. Is there any report of anchor length flags getting caught in windlasses, especially low profile windlasses?
Oh, boy. By flags, you must mean like strap ties that you wrap around the links. I wouldn't think you'd put like a fabric flag on an anchor chain. Whatever it is has to be able to go across the gypsy of the windlass. You could experiment with that.
How and when to attach a second anchor off the stern to prevent swing?
Wow, that's advanced anchoring 101. Okay, good question. You've got an anchor off the bow, and maybe you're in a channel of some sort, and you don't want the boat to swing around that anchor and get into the channel. Yes, absolutely valid. You could start with anchoring the stern anchor, motor forward, anchor the bow anchor, and situate the boat somewhere between the two. And the boat, under normal conditions, will stay between the two of them. Yeah.
What about going to Alaska where it's too deep to anchor and you're next to rocks and shore?
Right. I was afraid somebody would bring that up.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, maybe it's addressed in the situation where you're floating into Louisa Inlet, and it's sheer cliffs. Actually, I think we can go to the camera if you want to. Yeah. So you got sheer cliffs all the way down to the bottom of 200 or 300 feet. There might be a little bit of a shelf you could anchor on, but it's not enough to create any scope. So the answer there is to tie off to something on the shore, stern tie. And that helps to put in more boats in a narrow anchorage, for example. In the Canadian islands, I see them quite frequently. Long, narrow anchorage, boats stern tied to a tree or a ring in the rock and anchored off the bow. It's quite valid. It's fussy, but it can work. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And let's see, there was some other Are there any other questions? There was another slide you wanted to show as well. I think maybe let's go to that. So we've come up with the presentation by the Bellingham Sail and Power Squadron and many, many volunteers. Okay. What we're going to do is make a suggestion for you. If you're just starting out anchoring, do it lots. Go out for lunch on the hook. Just get the feel of a boat in daylight anchoring. Go out for an evening cruise, anchor for supper. Do it a lot, and then you get the hang of handling your anchor and enjoying the scenery. Another question.
One last question. My boat tends to swing more than many boats at the anchor. Any suggestions?
Yes. Good question. The question is the anchor's out, the wind's blowing, and other boats are sort of staying still, and his boat is going back and forth. I should go back to the camera here, but so the boat's swinging back and forth in the anchorage. There is a way to deal with that, and that's to put an auxiliary sail or something on the stern of your boat to line up the boat with the anchor so that the stern is being persuaded to line up with the anchor line. That helps at all. If it's a sailboat, it's quite easy. Get a small sail up on the back stay. If it's a power boat, you see some trawlers with an actual mast and boom affair. Other boats, get inventive. See if you can come up with something. Yeah.
Mostly a lot of thank yous. And is there a power squadron in Oak Harbor?
There is a power squadron in Oak Harbor. A squadron there, I've forgotten the name of it. But yes, in Oak Harbor, there's a very active bunch of people, and they're very friendly bunch. Okay, well, that's
You
good.
did good.
We are at the point where we'll cut off the workshop and invite you to sign up for the boat handling course, the one coming up or some other ones, or the America's Boating course, which is the sort of beginning course for people just getting started in boating and they want to know all the rules and regulations. We throw in a little bit of everything, including anchoring, radio, emergencies, and some navigation. So with that, I thank you for joining us. We'll see you out there on the bay sometime.
Thank you all. Appreciate you being here. We'll shut down the meeting now and hope that you join us for Mike Bove next Tuesday night. He's with the United States Coast Guard in Seattle. He'll be talking about vessel traffic separation and answering questions about the Coast Guard. If you don't get our e-blast, we have these communication e-blasts that go out from the Bellingham Sail and Power Squadron, and you would like to RSVP for the Coast Guard, you can contact me, Bill and I, at that RSVP@boatingisfun.org, where we sent you the handouts for tonight. And if you didn't get the handout, you can still contact Bill or I at the RSVP email, and we will send it to you. So thanks again, and see all of you another time. Bye. Good night.